Hello everyone. So today I would like to describe something which I call the cycle of observation. Now, this is an idea that I've had since December 2025, really, and it's generally been the lens through which I view reality in a conventional sense since that time. And it's currently May 2026, so that's kind of been my general MO when it comes to metaphysics for the last half year or so. Now, the reason why I haven't really spoken that much on it or developed that much is because it came from a really kind of earth-shattering moment in the development of my understanding when it comes to philosophy and especially metaphysics in December, which is when I began to grapple with the understanding that it might be possible for nothing to be knowable, for nothing to be ascertainable via metaphysical speculation, and that essentially there's no way of understanding, or at least it might be possible that there is no way of ascertaining the broader truths about the universe or consciousness, reality, and the relationships between those different entities or those different ideas. And so this is something that really shook me to my core because it was also influenced by the absurdist ideals and kind of the general sense, the question of how do you make meaning in a human life that is inherently meaningless, that all meaning is imposed by some existing superstructure and in society, and that once you strip that all away, the connection between all of these different quantities, there's basically kind of no guiding principle that exists just supernaturally independent of all of these social structures. And of course the answer to that is to live, in defiance, to live rebelliously. And I think that's been really inspiring in some sense, but it still kind of produced this this philosophical byproduct, I guess, in my understanding. And it may be entirely possible that people in the past, that thinkers across numerous different traditions, have described this exact process in detail. But this is just kind of the way that I've come to understand it myself. So, generally speaking, the cycle of observation is what occurs when you try to understand the ultimate framework through which you should conceive of reality. So, in The Truths of the Universe, which I started writing in 2023, in the first chapter, which I finished that year, I posit my first point, or I suppose axiom, if you will, is I believe what I called them in the first section, is that only what is physically present exists, or only what is physically present is real. So this is a very kind of empiricist, materialist standpoint, but then immediately afterwards, I have to be able to back up these claims, because essentially what I'm doing is, first I'm trying to dispel any spiritual notions or conceptions of supernatural or magical quantities which might exist. And I am doing this by reinforcing the laws of physics and saying that what is physically present, what we know to exist and to be here, can verifiably exist. Now, when I say verifiably, that very quickly takes me on to the next point, which is how can this be verified at all? And so that immediately has to pivot to the way in which we, or I mean, later on it's going to become much more evident why I might say I, perceive these objects or these entities. And that comes down to human perception. That comes down to our senses. We can rely on our senses, and through our senses we can get generally a pretty good, accurate picture, for what's relevant to us at a human scale of the physical material world as it exists. Now, this all rests on the conception that our senses are generally infallible. And even when I was saying human scale, it's obvious that we can't see subatomic particles. We don't have the capacity to observe things at that level. But then the next part of that statement, I even say, even if by means of an instrument, the senses are still used, which means that no matter how you're observing something, it ultimately always comes down to your senses. And if you're using an instrument that was created by logical and rational deduction from the material quantities which actually exist in the real world, and is generally supposed to give you an understanding that would only be an extension of what your physical senses can perceive. So we've established that only what's physically present exists, and the only way you can perceive that is through your own senses. But the problem arises when you understand that senses can be deceived. So first of all, there are hallucinations. You can have visual or auditory hallucinations. If you take like a psychedelic substance, for instance, that's going to alter your perception of the physical world around you. And there's the very big, nagging kind of sociological, or I suppose social, psychological elephant in the room of contextual framing, which is when we posit that there is kind of this ground or like a plane of physical material existence in which everything just exists equally and nothing that isn't physical actually exists, we might start grouping those into concepts or conceiving of it based on our prior notions, and those are entirely socially defined. And so now we're starting to get into a very different realm of philosophy that is looking at how society influences those beliefs. Now, that might be a lot more popular in a historical, critical sense framework, which is being discussed by many thinkers right now. And it's crucial to understand how that works in terms of society. But when it comes down to the purely physical basis of reality, I'm not making any claims about forms here. At a certain point in 2022, I was defending the idea of Platonic forms, but now I think through mereology, you can very easily break that down and break down the illusion of perfect, eternal, existing concepts to which something must adhere. Because even if you look at it on a social level, if those concepts are socially defined, and you have a different language, a different people, a different civilization, if you've never had any contact with one another, there might be almost nothing in common. And the more far you remove those social contexts, say you have like an alien civilization on another planet, they're going to have almost nothing in common when it comes to those forms, or it's possible that they could have nothing in common. At a certain point, the only forms which remain would be those which pertain to ideas like subject and object, yourself and the surrounding universe, and those very basic things which aren't physical objects. So that's not what I'm saying here. But what I am positing is that there is kind of this general ground or aggregate of physical existence which functions on its own. I would say independently. I would say, independently of non-physical processes. I think that all of those could be chalked up to physical processes, because even if a thought is occurring in someone's brain, that could be understood as, neurons and synapses that are going off, even though, don't quote me on that because I don't understand neurology too well, but generally speaking, I understand the idea that mental formations, as they are called, can be conceived through a neurological framework. So after this, like I was saying, even if you go purely based off of sense perception, I've been citing all these things like hallucinations and social conditioning, even though, like I said, that doesn't apply to the broader framework here. But I haven't touched on the major point, which is the reason why I came up with this idea that the senses can be deceived, which is the profound realization that really started a lot of my metaphysical speculation, which is to say, seeing the film The Matrix. Now, I know to a lot of people that might just seem kind of like a shallow, pop culture, contemporary discourse on the nature of society and reality, and it doesn't really bring that much to the table in terms of serious historical analysis or serious, ontology or speculation of what actually exists or what is real. And while all that may be true, it did give me the idea and this terrible and profound notion that everything as we understand it can be completely unreal, for lack of a better term, simulated. And I am not going to say that this is the first time I had ever had this idea, because in this very kind of whimsical poem that I wrote in 2017, I was talking about dreams, and I said, what if dreams are real and reality is not? Which is a very, very old philosophical question posed possibly by the ancient Greeks and definitely in the Taoist scriptures concerning Zhuangzi. And what I remember was said in the scriptures from some surface level research is the idea of a butterfly. And this is just my vague recollection, but that if a butterfly is, if you have someone essentially who is in their waking life and you can understand that they are conceiving of things as they are, but then immediately afterwards they go into a dream, unless you're lucid dreaming, in which you still have the conception that there is some broader reality which exists, and that you're not in that reality, which kind of gives you this interesting Gnostic framework of you're in this simulation, but outside of the simulation there is a broader reality. But within that dream, most of the time you'll believe that the dream is reality. And so here's the shocking kind of question, which may seem very stupid, and I'll address that immediately afterwards, but the realization is that there's nothing that inherently makes your self-affirmation of physical existence in waking life any more or less valid than that of when you exist within a dream. As a matter of fact, sometimes those concepts can cross over in your mind, and when I'm having a dream, for instance, I can think about explaining concepts, even such as these, which I'm describing right now, to someone else in that dream. And it's possible that those mental formations can transfer in a very similar way that they would in waking life. Now, the only major limit on this is the obvious fact, or at least it seems obvious to us, that real life is a continuous stream of perceptions, and your memory and consciousness kind of ties it to everything else. And the idea of your memory that goes on is something that legitimizes waking life as the ultimate ground of reality. And since dreams are just kind of these disconnected fragments through which you always seem to be waking up and falling asleep, unless one of the dreams was real life and all of the other dreams and reality all together are almost like a giant dream in and of themselves, then your dreams really, which would be far less likely than waking life, especially given the physical sensation and the insistence of the material world when you are in waking life. That would be extremely unlikely, and that's the only context in which those dream worlds, essentially, which you inhabit, could get some legitimacy over the physical world. And so I think that, generally speaking, this dream hypothesis does run into some issues. However, and here's the major point, one of the many different metaphysical speculations which I began to understand after seeing The Matrix was that relatively quickly, within like half a year or so, I had already moved on from the idea that a simulated reality that is just one layer of simulation in which our physical bodies are actually real, people are actually real, the consciousnesses actually exist, and we're just interacting through this mediated, albeit disgusting, pseudo-physical framework for the material gain of what's essentially artificial intelligence, as it's portrayed in the movie, was not very terrifying idea at all. At that point, I already moved on to conceptions that what if you were living in, for example, a dream, and it's just a very realistic dream, and that only once you live out the rest of your life in this dream and die, then you wake up. It's tantamount to Inception. It's very similar to Inception, actually, and I don't know if that was around the time that I saw the movie, but it did give a very fascinating sense of, well, how many layers of dream can you be, encased within right now? It could be an exorbitantly high number, or another, really terrifying idea is that it could be infinite. And this is where you start to touch on the idea that infinite existence and annihilation are both, and like total annihilation after death, a complete dissolution of consciousness, are both these extremely terrifying prospects. And that there's so many variations of the infinite existence which could go on. There could be a completely senseless existence in which if you don't have any thoughts, then that's kind of like, well, you don't have any thoughts, you don't have any emotions, and thinking about your existence in that sense, there is technically nothing to feel emotional about because it will not be torment for you. It can't be painful at all because you're not going to have any of the things that would allow you to feel those sensations, whether strictly mental, emotional, or physical. However, then you can get to these scenarios like if you wind up in a room, essentially, for an infinite amount of time after death, and that's just what happens to your consciousness again, because we're saying this is all predicated on the theory that the mind, the consciousness, or I should just say the consciousness, not the mind, is the only entity which we can conceive of, it's our consciousness conceiving of itself, that we can prove to be true. And when we say prove, we just mean proof to ourselves, and that it's self-evident and almost in a way doesn't require a proof, but it's almost like not knowing in the sense that knowing is there's some external truth and then there's a process by which you obtain the knowledge and now you kind of have it in your conception now. No, this is almost like direct contact, and that when in connection with something, you would quote unquote know it because it is you. It's literally applicable to your physical existence in a way that doesn't require any process of knowing or understanding. It's just inherently there. And if there's any knowledge, it might sit in the same space of things which you can call your repository of knowledge, but it doesn't require that process. And so with explaining that out of the way, I think it's interesting to explore if we're understanding that the consciousness is really the only material entity we can understand, or not material entity, but the only entity which we can prove to exist, because it is the framework for understanding that these physical entities exist at all, then that is the framework by which I would legitimize thinking of an afterlife or reincarnation at all. Because if the senses can be deceived, then that can mean that this physical material ground is not the ultimate reality, and that the consciousness can essentially determine that, which could mean in a weird way that it might be possible to will your existence to anything. Essentially, if you genuinely believe anything is true, then that will be your physical reality. And it leads to this very funny situation of, well, if you believe you can fly, then you actually can fly. And if you try jumping off a building and you say, well, it's okay, I've psyched myself into it, I believe that I can, then, and you fall, and you splat on the ground, then, I would come back with a cynical retort, oh, well, you haven't really fully internalized your belief yet. There's still a shred of doubt. You still don't fully believe it. You haven't actually succeeded in that. And there would be no way to disprove my point, which is a pretty awful kind of practical joke to play on someone. But it does concern the idea that ultimately we believe so deeply in the physical reality of the world as it presents itself to us that it's difficult to think of anything else. However, the very idea that we only know these things through consciousness, we're only going based off of our consciousness, which is fed through the perceptions, which are an extension of the physical body, which is somehow connected to our consciousness, then that means that anything which can be possible for the consciousness to perceive could be something which we can perceive. And I'm not even saying it could be something which is real, but basically when that happens, it's something we could understand to be true. And so this creates some issues because it does open up a whole realm of possibility of an afterlife, or an infinite series of essentially concentric dreams which recur, or many ideas which I most eloquently and completely laid out in chapter 2 of The Truths of the Universe, to which I currently don't have access right now. But theories like eternal return or eternal recurrence, reincarnation, rebirth, and the existence within a physical space for an eternal amount of time, existence within, an eternal, unending universe for an eternal amount of time, or essentially any kind of limited afterlife, or an afterlife which is literally just your consciousness continues on, but there's no semblance of physical space or anything else. And so there's so many different possibilities which could kind of branch out from that. But generally speaking, this is the idea. Now, the problem is that because I am going based off of my own consciousness, and I'm even using the first person pronoun, which is to say I, a lot of people who make anti-solipsistic arguments would posit that the very fact that one would have to use the first person pronoun and other pronouns would serve as good evidence that essentially, since you have to differentiate, since one would have to differentiate themselves from the rest of the universe, it proves the existence that there is a rest of the universe. However, I think this is fundamentally a limit of language itself, and that it's almost like a trap. And if you take the limit of language as the limit of reality, then it essentially means that you are giving in your argument and the ultimate truth which could be behind that, which is difficult to express because language fundamentally doesn't allow you to express it. And so it's kind of like you're existing in this trap and you're trying to get out of the trap by using a cage, like by using the bars that are in the cage to get yourself out, which doesn't make any sense to me. But if I were to say that rather than just saying I or my experience, replacing it with perception itself, this would be would sound like an extremely egoistic statement to make. And this is the problem when espousing these theories, especially within solipsism, of the risk you run of sounding entirely egoistic or narcissistic, when in reality it is just completely based on epistemological speculation, which is saying that here is what I would just call the unaskable question, because I'm about to pose it, but it might not make any sense from the outside, which is essentially using my set of language, which I would prefer to use, rather than just saying, oh, from my observation of the universe, and again, using the first person pronouns, strictly within this framework, would say something like, if the universe has been entirely, or I could just say, how is it possible that there is essentially a framework of reality in which multiple consciousnesses all exist or manifested through, animal forms, or maybe even life forms, if you would extend the idea that other life forms beyond animals have consciousness. Or you could take that even further and say non-living things and go for, an animist route, I suppose, if you wanted to. But generally speaking, the idea that there are all these consciousnesses out there which exist through physical beings in the world, and that they all have complete and total legitimacy as existing independent constructs, and that the one which is referred to as me is simply one of these many existing physical forms, but in reality, for as long as the universe has existed, it has been perceived through my consciousness. Now, that last part is really the inflammatory segment there, because it's essentially saying, and it's the classic joke about, when a solipsist dies, the whole universe goes with them. But it's the truth that there's ultimately nothing else that's knowable. So one question that arises in response to the unaskable question is, should it even be asked? Essentially, should it just be taken on faith that there are multiple different consciousnesses which exist, and that, by definition, unless there is some external God being which exists, it would only make sense for my perception to be one of those consciousnesses and just kind of exist randomly in the particularity of this world and the particularity of this universe, which I have also said gives rise to the idea that if it's just kind of a coincidence, or not a coincidence, but just a random chance that I am born of this particular person in this particular place in this particular planet, that it would also be true that since all of those possibilities are things, all the other possibilities are things which didn't come true, but which are apparent and available and, are possibilities themselves by definition, then it is also likely that the same applies to different universes. And it's saying, okay, why am I in this body? Is this person born in this year at this time? It would also be, why am I in this reality in which everything takes a very specific path and exists exactly where it is, and that things don't happen in any other way? Because you could say, oh, well, it's just a simple cause and effect, but ultimately things come down to the combination of subatomic particles reacting in certain ways, and that's probabilistic, and that it could be possible that they take completely different paths. And so those events which happen could lead to other universes. My current working theory, or at least when I was recording my Theories of the Universe Part 2 in 2020, was that these timelines do exist. We're just kind of cordoned off from them and don't have a way of perceiving them right now, but they do exist. Or if you could go for a continuous rather than discrete view of space-time, that rather than viewing them as just parallel existing different universes, then it's actually a continuous spectrum of the fifth dimension, rather than saying time is the fourth dimension of kind of traveling back and forth along a cause and effect, or the dimension which mediates cause and effect. It would be a dimension where you would be traveling almost horizontally in a certain sense, if you were to use that analogy, in which the different possible cause and effects could result in different realities, and that those that is essentially just unavailable to us in a certain sense, but it does exist. So that's one interesting way of looking at it. But outside of that, I would generally say that through this solipsistic conception of the universe, people say, well, you can make a compromise by looking at other brains and other minds and seeing how sophisticated and how advanced they are. But if you're existing within a dream, the people within the dream aren't real at all. This is a pretty good analogy. They are completely projections of your subconscious mind or whatever mental formations you have that are going on at that moment, which aren't in your waking life. But within this physical world, which is what I kind of posited from the ultimate reality of the Matrix when I'm thinking about metaphysical speculation, is that I kind of conceded the most likely option for physical existence is the Boltzmann brain, which is, I was explaining this to a kid one year, actually, when I was at an Interlochen summer camp in Michigan, and I believe that it was 2021, but it could have been 2022. Now, like I say, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I do remember essentially going up to this kid who was around my age and explaining these concepts to him and engaging in a sort of debate whereby I undid every single one of his prior conceptions of the existence of physical reality as self-evident, and until a point where he was so frustrated by the new conception which I had essentially created that the only provable entity to ourselves is our own consciousness, which I had demonstrated to him, made him so frustrated that he kind of just exploded and threw a fit and ran away. And I think we reconciled after that, but the idea that it's just so powerful that it could drive someone to that feeling is because it delegitimizes the existence of everything else around someone. Now, if we're saying, the fact that, I would have to use language using words like I and you to explain these things signifies that there are other beings in the universe through which I have to communicate. Well, that's not true at all. Like I demonstrated by explaining that, the limits of language are these kind of artificially imposed barriers, but also through dreams, it signals that essentially, if I'm thinking about this within the construct of a Boltzmann brain, then it would be, even looking at like a Wikipedia article on the Boltzmann brain, it's very difficult to read about those kind of theories of consciousness without the language becoming very awkward, because then immediately you start to see phrases like this mind, in which it's talking about the subject, and the subject from the only conception which has existed throughout the universe using the language which I just described would be my own consciousness. Now, of course, this would immediately spark the rebuttal among all of the evidently conscious minds that exist that, well, no, it's someone else's consciousness, because they would be the one who would be arguing. But ultimately, considering that they are all only representations of physical matter and energy as it exists in my mind, then there is basically no recourse for that, and that the Boltzmann brain, I posited to explain this, the theory of a greater and a lesser brain. The greater brain is kind of what's running the simulation and what everything exists, all of the thoughts, all the possibilities, and it knows everything that is necessary to make this universe and the parts of the universe which are perceivable by me exist. And the lesser brain is what I would call myself and exist and identify with. And it kind of sits within this basin and has a certain sum of knowledge, but interacts with the surrounding things which are not yet known to it, but are known by the greater brain. And the greater brain posits it holds all of these ideas like physical structures which exist and provides sensations and provides this kind of lush, intricate experience of reality as well as other minds. And so it's fully possible that they would be representations of something. And it functions exactly in the same way that's analogous to the human brain itself, even just within one brain. And if I was saying that within the human brain, you can know something, but have it be completely basically you can know something completely unconsciously of the fact that you know it. This can be achieved via all these different methods like hypnosis, and it can be achieved in a way that, if you have a memory that's repressed, you can know something and you can have a knowledge of something without even realizing. And so in the same way, the division between the greater brain and the lesser brain would literally just be the division between those things which are the mind that exists, the Boltzmann brain, the one fundamental substance which exists, know that it basically the things that it knows, and then the rest of it knows, but it isn't aware that it knows. And that is what kind of positions, that creates an illusion that the consciousness is the lesser brain and that it's not just the greater brain, that the lesser brain is this one person and the greater brain is the world around them. And then that, I think, could actually be a very, I think that could work as an explanation of why, we, and I would say we, assuming that this is not true, ironically, it's kind of like solipsism for everyone. Everybody would go around thinking that they are the one true mind, but just to present this theory in a way that it isn't considered egoistically offensive to the rest of the universe. But I think the irony of that is that if it is true, then the only person I'm explaining this to is myself. And so therein lies a major paradox. But without, going outside of that, it's interesting because there's kind of, naive realism, which would accept that other beings are true simply because they are perceived to exist. And then there is total solipsism, which posits that because they are not knowable via the, internal realization of consciousness, or the internal immediate knowledge of consciousness to itself that it exists, because it is itself. So obviously it knows itself that it exists. Because that doesn't happen for any other being. There's no way of proving that, and essentially it's kind of rejected outright. There is generally posited this kind of middle way attempt at reconciling the two, which says that, well, you can understand that, again, the argument that by language you have to use separate pronouns to refer to separate people and yourself, and create a subject-object distinction so that there are other people that exist out there and that they have sufficient minds and are doing independent things. Well, like I say, with the idea of a greater mind and a lesser mind, and the idea of the limits of language as they exist, as kind of creating this false trap, both of those things can, I think, be disproven. But basically putting that aside, that is just the ultimate, that's the fine line and the difficulty of that. So to reconcile that, I try to think about ideas of the universe as it exists and as it is created, which combine this theory of solipsism with a theory of open individualism, with pantheism, and with panpsychism. And those all go together because the idea is, if you're understanding how the universe would be created, there would have to be some force which would lead to the creation of the universe, and that if that force is not evident in the physical matter, then it must be the only thing which isn't the matter, which is the consciousness of the universe. And if the consciousness of the universe only exists in an assortment of different beings, then it's basically kind of cordoned off or trapped in different globules, which are created by the matter of the universe. And those consciousnesses are the individual people, which means that it's not that everything is God, but every consciousness is God. And it also means that, by definition, if every consciousness is God and God is one thing, the same substance or the same essence, or homoousios, as they say, then that means that every consciousness belongs to the same person. Which would somewhat clear up my theory, or my question about, okay, if there are supposedly multiple people that exist, then why has the universe the whole time been perceived through my consciousness? But it doesn't clear up the question about the particularity, and through which the only reasonable answer for the response, or the gaping silence of the void, is it's just a question that shouldn't be asked, which leads to the metaphysical absurdism of it. But ultimately, all of these conceptions of pantheism and panpsychism and open individualism, which kind of come together to create this unified theory, which I synthesized earlier with the unity of being, wahdat al-wujud, and Manichaeism, to kind of create the truths of the universe, and started working on that. The first 3 chapters, which I enumerated based on the most coherent theories which I formed up until that point, 2025, radically stopped during that period and were almost violently broken off. Now, why would that be? What would happen during that period to cause it? Well, I think, like I said, it was just the ultimate conflict coming into fruition of the fact that none of those ideas of reality, of the afterlife, or what that could be like, are fundamentally knowable, because again, they're all mediated by consciousness. And that essentially, I think what you have to do is you have to start with the physical material reality as it exists, and then work your way from there, rather than starting with logical rational deductions and working your way from the top down. So this is kind of the early divide of Enlightenment philosophy as I understand it. But from those physical observations, then you can start to make, logical connections based off of those. Of course, obviously, the logical connections are necessary and crucial if you want to make any progress in the, metaphysical understanding, but you can't start with them. So the physical observation is of the material world, but then immediately afterwards, you have to understand that the only reason through which you can perceive that material physical world is by consciousness. So that means the only entity which you can understand to exist is the consciousness through which you perceive the material world, and that almost the perception gets kind of taken back a step in the process, in the chain. Then you could lead to this almost George Berkeley theory of I believe it's called subjective idealism, that essentially there are only minds which exist. Now, sorry for the noise. If there's noise right now, I had to relocate. But essentially what I was saying is that there's this theory that you can fall back on, ultimately, which is the insistence of the lens through which we view reality. Now, Berkeley realized this, Kant realized this, a lot of different thinkers have come across this idea at some time or another, and the problem is that ultimately there is essentially no recourse for this within the tradition of metaphysics I am using right now, and there is still this constant rebuttal that is very easy to reach as soon as you adopt this perspective, which is that consciousness as a process, as a mental formation. You can talk about the 5 skandhas of Buddhism and how they kind of constitute the illusion of a self or a singular being, but that essentially they're only brought into existence as a result of physical processes. And so the development of the human body and the development of the psyche in accordance with the brain, which the growth of the brain as an actual physical procedure, which my original theory would dictate exists and is something that genuinely happens. Otherwise, it essentially kind of destroys the whole Berkeleyan perspective that only minds exist, because in order for consciousness, which is the very basis for observing reality, to develop, there has to be a physical, it's grounded in the physical world. Now, of course, hopefully not, but potentially irreconcilable difference between these perspectives is that when you have the understanding of consciousness as a perspective, it is something that is the unified and singular perspective through which all of these other things are observed. Now, having mental formations, having thoughts and feelings and emotions and sensory perceptions, which are all things which are very easily to chalk up to physical sensations that happen and are mediated by the body and by physical matter and reality, are the only way which I can really come to these conclusions, as a consciousness. But ultimately, the person who is espousing them, the fact that it is not what might be called a philosophical zombie, is because there is a consciousness behind them. And this consciousness enables for those views to represent that of an individual. And I'm not saying the self in the sense that there are all these other social factors, and there are all these messy things, and the sense perceptions and whatnot. But no, the very perspective, the point of view, the idea that if you were to die at some point, from your point of view, there would be absolutely nothing, there would be no sense perception, but the feeling of time would continue. Now, of course, you get to this question of the definitions here, which is saying, well, if there are no sense perceptions, if there are no feelings or thoughts, then does time functionally continue for you at all? Which is the idea that, when people say that time stops or something as you approach the center of a black hole, that it's kind of slows down. And what's really happening when you're in the void of space and you're in a super low density area of outer space, what you're experiencing is that there isn't any physical motion or matter that's happening whatsoever. And so functionally, even though from a classical perspective time continues, and it's kind of just the independent basin through which these physical processes are mediated, it functionally means nothing, because it's kind of the koan, like if a tree falls in the woods, no one is there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Well, the theory and the thinking with the passage of time in an area which undergoes no physical matter change whatsoever would be that time doesn't pass, because the only indication for the passage of time is defined by the change of physical reality and the changes which occur within the three dimensions of space. And if that's not going on, I think that it might be kind of a similar thing here. Like if there are no sense perceptions and there are no thoughts, feelings, or emotions whatsoever, but time continues ad infinitum, would it be time whatsoever, or would it just be an eternal, not sempiternal, but eternal consciousness which exists almost outside of time in a sense, and does not experience it as a constant passage of one moment to the next, because there are no moments. There is no point of reference because there are no thoughts. So this might dissolve the issue of the afterlife entirely, but it still doesn't resolve problems that have to do with what would happen at that point, and that's your perspective, that's your POV. But say after that, after a certain amount of time, you're reborn, or maybe you're reborn instantly, or however that happens, however that takes place. Essentially what happens is that you're reincarnated into a new being, and you have totally different thoughts. And this is a major factor in my early speculation of the existence of reality and the way through which we can understand reality, and the idea of a dream theory, which really gives a lot of legitimacy and credence to those theories I was espousing earlier, or I was exploring earlier at the very least, which is the idea of memory. Now, if memory is something which can be destroyed, which can happen within the course of a lifetime, it's still the same fundamental POV consciousness string of moments from one to the next, but the linear connection which stretches back across time and connects distant moments in the past to present ones, which is to say memory, and that you can kind of recall a moment even though it is not physically present, it's not physically happened, that's something that happened at another point in time, which is to say another point in space-time, then that can be completely cut off, and you can have a sort of amnesia. Now, if we're saying this is what happens with rebirth, this is always the funny theory of like, why do babies cry so much, especially upon birth? Well, because they still have some faint lingering memories of the fact that they are not truly free from the cycle of samsara, and they're kind of having this existential horror about how awful it is that they have to undergo this constant cycle of reincarnation, which ultimately ends in suffering and death time and time again, so that they are reborn into a new life, and that they understand that if they can't essentially attain enlightenment within this lifetime, it's just kind of going to keep going indefinitely. And so that's kind of a funny explanation for that. But regardless, it's possible that, because you say that just your physical foundations for memory, your brain, are not very developed at that age, and especially like right after you're born. And so what happens ultimately is that in your life, you have no memory or no recollection. That's what people can't remember. It's almost a very kind of convenient haze for understanding the beginnings of life, is that you can't understand the moment you were conceived. You don't remember that because you didn't yet have the memory-making foundations. You were just like a singular cell. But if we're talking about memory transfer across lifetimes, it could be that in the next lifetime, you have no memory whatsoever. And this is, I remember the experiment of like the shoemaker or something like that, or a tailor, and I'm forgetting exactly, but I believe it was an Enlightenment era thought experiment, which basically said that if someone experienced a near total death, or like a near-death experience, where 5 aspects of their identity were lost, which were memory, personality, moral compass, and there were some more metaphysically substantial ones. At what point, or at any of those, would the person be considered to be a new person? It's almost like an identitarian kind of ship of Theseus in a sense. But I think that I almost laughed at thinking about the moral compass, like that's absolutely not true whatsoever. Someone can get brainwashed, they can get convinced of a different theory, they can totally change up their ideological worldview. The human mind, from what I understand, is extremely fragile and is very malleable and is susceptible to transforming and adapting in all sorts of ways under extreme amounts of pain and pressure. And so to think that because someone has, changed their moral compass, that they're fundamentally a different person might be nice in an emotional sense, but purely thinking of it from the physical reality, I don't think that has any basis. However, when you start to get to concepts like memory, I don't agree that it would make that person a fundamentally new person either, but it does pose some interesting ideas. So if we're saying that the memory stopped completely, and that has happened to people, I've known people to whom that's happened, but say the memory stops at that point, and memory-making procedures continue as they were before, but there is a kind of total break in the memory from what happened before up until that point. Well, it's interesting to say, because if we think about dreams as existing in this way, there are memories that I have sometimes in dreams of a past dream which existed a long time ago, or a past memory that I did, and in the dream it almost seems as if it's presented by an external force, again, almost like an unusual, I don't unusually familiar interaction with the greater mind, that, oh yeah, you just had these memories before. You just don't remember them right now, but they did happen. Almost as if your parents are showing you photos of something that happened when you were like 2 years old, and you don't have any conscious recollection of it, but you just take it on faith because it's a photo, and why would they lie to you, right? And so it's kind of a similar thing. But then as soon as I wake up from these dreams, I'm thinking, that never happened at all. I have absolutely zero memory or recollection of that whatsoever. Which means one of two things. That either A, it was just a completely fabricated memory from the dream. It wasn't a genuine memory. It had no basis in reality whatsoever. Or B, that it was a real memory, but for some reason was only accessible to me at that point in the dream. And now in real waking life, I am there's a discontinuity, and I'm broken off or cordoned off from that memory. So, like I'm saying here, this poses a number of interesting implications for my theories. So if we're talking about the development of physical processes which result in consciousness, that is true. However, nothing explains the singular unified perspective of consciousness, I think, and maybe it's that I haven't studied the materialist doctrine, or that I haven't looked deeply enough at the scriptures which explain the formation of skandhas. But with all of the things that happen, like, memory process neurologists are doing some very important work right now, and they are determining essentially how that comes to be, and that has some very fascinating intersections with metaphysics and ontology and epistemology, of course. But aside from that, the idea that there is a POV, just that fundamental awareness, it's like a binary circuit. It's it's on or it's off, and it's mediated by your physical body and by all of those the different skandhas which are in accordance with the physical body, which arise as a result of it. Like, sensory perceptions are possibly the most obvious because of the way that your sense organs are connected to your brain and how that is connected to your consciousness. Those inform the decisions that you make. But ultimately, it's almost like your identity, yourself, is like a costume that is being worn by your consciousness, whereas the consciousness is literally just an awareness. It doesn't make any decisions. It doesn't do anything. It is simply the thing that watches. It is, if you're talking to someone, or even if you're talking to yourself, it's the voice that's listening. It is, your POV, essentially, that fundamental. And so between that and everything else is the dualistic conception, the dualistic almost, I guess, concept you could say that I created, as opposed to like just a mind-body duality, because again, that can be very easily dismantled. But this other form of dualism is interesting because it's almost like it puts the universe in a balloon shape, and the material of the actual balloon, as well as the little the end of the balloon where it gets kind of tied up and all cinched up, is your perception, or, as I said at one point, the perceptive essence, which is the consciousness. And the consciousness is perceiving everything that is inside of the balloon. And inside of the balloon is the matter, sensory perceptions, willpower, decisions, thoughts, ideas, feelings, material, existence, physical matter, things like that. And all of that is encompassed within the consciousness. Now, the consciousness is inherently tied to the matter. This is where the analogy might start to fall apart a little bit, but it's inherently tied to the matter, which is inside the balloon. But the point at which you call yourself, which is that end to the balloon, everything that's holding it all together, the kind of point, as it were, can observe itself. It can look at the other side of the balloon and say, well, this is a balloon. This is me observing myself. And I can also observe the rest of the physical universe, which is the area inside the balloon, but it can't see anything outside of itself. So it can kind of make these inferences, but yeah, that's what I was saying about consciousness is not like, a fundamental willpower, but almost just like a singular existence, something that either exists or doesn't. And this is what I tried to expand to other people. Now, this has some interesting connections to the idea of physical subatomic particles as being determinants of consciousness. But I think that ultimately it has very little bearing on how they actually function when it comes to consciousness. In this model, at least. Because in that model, they are essentially what is conscious. And that actually aligns very well with the panpsychist theory that consciousness is simply another property of subatomic matter, like spin or charge. So this, I think, when we're thinking about consciousness as essentially this kind of being that is either on or off, it aligns more with the theories I espoused on consciousness and the universe. But ultimately, there's some basis to it which is fundamentally alien, as I called it, to physical matter, which, from which the dualism arises, the duality arises in the truths of the universe. But it is fundamentally interlinked and intertwined and mediated by, it is given a reason to exist, or an ability to exist, by the physical matter itself. And is tied up with all these other things like sense perception, free will, thoughts and feelings, and all of those different factors cause some issues for trying to isolate consciousness and understand it by itself, because without all of those things, it is merely just awareness or perceptive essence, something that can perceive the rest of the universe, that when given all of these kind of tools or extensions of itself in the form of matter and things like sense perception, is able to kind of expand and assert its identity over that of a human being or an animal or anything else that we deem to have consciousness. And so this is the one theory that, but the irony is it rests on physical matter, because if there was no physical matter, the consciousness couldn't appear in a void. We don't have any idea that the consciousness can't exist, although again, that's something that we can't prove. But every conscious being that we know to exist is a being which is constituted by physical matter and the physical procedures which can allow it to exist and can allow it to be conscious. So that causes some problems, but ultimately there is still the perspective that consciousness as we understand it, this is again the weird kind of compromise that I have to make, where I'm talking about consciousness as this unique, standalone, fundamentally alien substance, which is really to service the solipsistic understanding of the universe. But I'm describing it in a way which is inherently pluralistic and could be applied to anyone, so it's more of a Perkelian perspective. It's almost like we're all solipsists together in a weird way. And it's definitely not exactly like that, but it does echo the theory that only not minds, but only consciousnesses exist and are provable entities, or at least that they're fundamentally separate from physical matter, even if they are dependent on physical matter to really manifest. But then the difficulty with this is there's still this insistence that even consciousness itself and the perceptive essence is really just a very advanced form, because we saw that life, as it evolved, whether we're saying that viruses, which are not deemed to be life forms, are conscious, creates an interesting kind of edge case. But the ultimate understanding of that distinction is that there may be a sort of evolution of less conscious to more conscious beings, and that once you get down to a certain point, if you don't have a fully developed, like, vertebrate brain that is shared by mammals and amphibians, reptiles, different types of fish, birds, that the consciousness is going to be a lot simpler. And at a certain point, it's kind of a spectrum where it transitions into just a natural sense perception, which can be completely chalked up to the processes inherent to physical matter, which would mean that there is no points fundamentally separating from physical matter, and that it's the same thing, which kind of dissuades the whole dualistic perspective and kind of leads you back to monism. But when thinking about the development of consciousness in this way, it means that, it's fundamentally created by physical matter. But again, how are you able to know that? And what's telling you that? It's consciousness, So that provides the basis for our understanding of the physical matter which defines consciousness. But what creates the basis for the consciousness through which you're able to understand that? Physical matter. And it's because it's through physical matter which consciousness is able to arise. But how are we able to understand that fact? Again, it's through consciousness. And so this is the cycle of observation. Now, I apologize if it took a while for me to get to the final point of the explanation, but I hope that the theories and discourses I have explored along the way have resulted in a greater understanding overall and created a more substantial model of the way that the universe works. And I would call the cycle of observation a new and perhaps my most eloquent yet framework for understanding reality. But I don't think that it's even a framework for understanding reality. What I think it is a framework for conveying the total inability that I now have, and anybody else who has arrived at this theory now has, for grasping the true nature of reality. So, that's the cycle of observation. And I think that, again, now looking at Buddhist metaphysics and the way in which the world works in traditions which do not share this ideological lineage, it is very easy to kind of think about other ways of understanding the universe that do not necessitate the existence and the inception of this cycle. But every perspective that I have yet understood when trying to reconcile the material basis for reality and the resulting materialist perspective with the basis of consciousness for understanding reality, and the resulting idealist perspective, then this is what results. And it's kind of a synthesis of the two, but such that they both disprove one another, almost creating the image of Pisces with two fish which are kind of swimming in a circle and are both eating each other's tails, or like an Ouroboros, but instead of being composed of one snake, it's two, like a dog chasing its own tail, but with two dogs, because there are two perspectives here, not two fundamental grounds or ways of understanding reality, but two profound moments of realization. One in which we understand that the basis for consciousness to exist is physical, which is very easy to see from the outside perspective, but we also must apply to ourselves. And the other, through which we understand that even if we believe that consciousness is a result of physical processes, it still rests on our understanding of the universe as we perceive it and not as it actually exists, so there's no way to know that. And these 2 points exist in tandem to create this constant, eternal, everlasting cycle. And now I don't mean eternal in that obviously it's not like a physical thing that actually exists again. It's a mental concept that I've created to help explain this. But if you follow the logic, you try to follow the logic in a linear way of debate, it's this constant conception that one idea disproves the other, and the other idea in turn disproves the first, and it continues so on and so forth ad infinitum. So there you go. That's the cycle of observation.